I want to talk a little bit about what we said last time. As you know, this year, Earlham College or many other colleges are particularly concerned about questions of equity, racial justice, cultural or international justice, I suppose. And one of the ways in which that we discuss this issue is that we need to address these issues somehow, but they don't really come to the core of what we are doing. So we do something in class and we think that those issues are not related to justice, racial equality, etc. But we need to address those issues as a separate problem or as a separate discussion. And I know some faculty is doing some work on that. But one of the problems with that approach is that some of the things that we do academically as well as like in terms of career building, etc., do actually contribute to the question of racial injustice and inequality in society. So university is somewhat complicit in perpetuating a certain worldview that is problematic. So we always have this discussion among faculty, and some of us always bring up this issue unless we think of the curriculum in a different way and try to understand what we teach as a part of the problem, then we really cannot really address these questions structurally. Of course, we can address it sort of coincidentally in terms of certain historical periods. This year was particularly sort of heated in these debates, but this is not the only year. It's not going to be the only year. It has been like that for a number of years in American society. I mean, 4 years ago, we were still talking about police brutality and unfair treatment of minorities in the United States. 14 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago. This is really not anything new. And part of the issue is we continue our lives like business as usual. And part of that business as usual is teaching ancient Greek philosophy, which is what Western tradition, which is predominantly from a white perspective, considers to be part of its history. So in terms of my problem with ancient Greek philosophy as a body of knowledge is not so much what they say, although what they say might be considered to be problematic at some points, but how we consider that as a part of Western tradition. Western tradition in the sense that the West says, we go all the way back to the Greeks. And you know, this is a story, there is as much evidence to trace your history back into anything else for that matter, in terms of influence, in terms of exchange of ideas. But Western tradition says Greeks. Greeks is our origin somehow. And this has been going on for at least a couple of centuries, if not more. I mean, a couple of millennia, actually. Sorry. So then the question becomes, why do we consider certain things belonging to us and certain things are not belonging to us? So why ancient Greek philosophy? Why not any other ways of thinking within the history? Why do we say, well, Chinese is not ours, Egyptian is not ours. They don't have any impact on us, but the Greeks do. And of course, there are historical reasons for that, but it is also problematic. So the reason that I was bringing up all this discussion about ancient Greek philosophy, I teach this class in Turkey, which now in parentheses, they say millet or miletus, depending on how you say it, is, they say, in western western parts of Turkey, western coast of Turkey. Well, Turkey is not a country that Western philosophy sort of owns or sort of appropriates or claims to be its own. So that right there in and of itself is bringing this issue of how do we identify a tradition? how do we say that we belong to a tradition and exclude others from our tradition? So we usually think of questions of exclusion very sort of from a contemporary perspective. We exclude certain people, minorities in certain contexts, etc. But this exclusion has a long history. It is not just like whatever bad things that we have done with respect to the past, but the positive ways in which we identify ourselves and excluded others. So we always think about the issue of identity in terms of its potentially positive aspects to contribute to the diversity, but every identity that we associate with, by definition, excludes others. And more importantly, there's a history of that. So yes, we may or may not belong to, and when we say I'm using this very broadly, ancient Greek philosophical tradition. May or may not, but the fact is we do identify with it. We do read them, we don't read others. We teach them, we don't teach others. We say that our history belongs with them, not others. And this is the history of university for the last at least 400 or 500 years. So we are teaching a Western curriculum. Now, whether that's right or wrong, whether we should do it or not, that's a legitimate question. But the fact that we do is not open for debate. That's who we are. That's how we identified ourselves for a number of centuries. So why am I talking about this? Because I want these questions to be in our minds as we read these people. Now, it might not be that that will affect the content of what we read very much in terms of Thales saying that it is water, the original stuff of everything. And you might say, well, I mean, where is the issue here? That seems to be a pretty straightforward, albeit simplistic identification of the origin of all stuff. Is this cultural? Yes and no. I mean, in fact, water is water everywhere, I suppose, if you are not drinking it. If you are drinking, it's not the same everywhere. But the fact that we look at the world in terms of physical stuff, we try to understand it in terms of physical properties, that's a important cultural distinction. And the fact that you understand water as not metaphorically, as everything flows or water-like or something like that, but actual physical water, that's a different worldview. That's a different way of understanding the world and relating to the world. And that kinds of ideas form identities, form traditions, and exclude others. So unless we are willing to think about our implication within white supremacy, among other things, the most importantly, in terms of what we do in the classroom, in the otherwise so-called curriculum, and like somewhat neutral stuff, like everybody should learn because that's our history or something like that, then we are not going to be able to address this question properly. So I want these questions to be, you know, at the front of your minds whenever you read these issues. We are reading a Western tradition. When I first started reading philosophy, I wondered, like, why millet? Millet is Turkey now. Like, we should claim that. Why are these like Americans and British and Germans are claiming this as their own? Like, it's ours. And then on the other hand, all the language that is used to philosophize or even think or even engage in scientific activity is Western. So today we are talking about neutrality of science, for example, but we hardly ask the question, what is the percentage of scientific publication in English language as opposed to other languages? Isn't that necessarily putting people who are capable of understanding, writing, publishing in English structurally into an advantageous position than other people? I mean, once in a while we give like Nobel Prize to people who don't speak English, sure, but What is the predominant language and why? I mean, how does that uh, fit with the so-called neutrality and objectivity and universality of science? And philosophy too. Like, in order to be able to engage in philosophical activity, I had to learn another language. And in order to be able to get a job, even in philosophical, whatever it is called, world, you need to operate in another language. Is this neutral? It's like, well, learn English. Sure. Have you learned English? Like, yeah, some of you did. I know you're international students, but some of you were born. So that really puts these questions into a different perspective, in the sense of how do we interpret our tradition? And whenever you are saying, regardless of your background, you are proud of your tradition, depending on historical circumstances, you should be, but you should also always be careful what you are not proud of, what you don't consider to be your own, what you consider to be excluded from your domain, and who executes that exclusion. I mean, if I want to exclude myself from American society, which I really want to, despite all the problems, that's one thing. But American society excluding me, that's a completely other thing. Okay, so we are reading, I mean, any questions, any comments about this? Anything you want to add? Anything that's unclear? Controversial that you want to object? Or controversial but you don't want to object?
Whenever I think about these kinds of things, as someone who is like in like passionate about a field in science, I think about like, so the book I'm reading right now, when scientific discoveries were being made about chemistry in like the 19th century, we'll say, or the 18th century or something, a lot of times there would be discoveries and advancements made simultaneously that weren't being acknowledged by different countries because of language barriers, and the papers were written in different languages. And it kind of hindered the progress of the field because everyone was working on the same things at the same time and coming up with um, results that essentially weren't necessary because they had already been proven in other places, but they didn't know. So in that sense, like I don't know, just thinking about the trade-offs of not necessarily like globalization of, but just like making all science papers, like the unofficial rule is they're all written in English or written in a language. Like, what is that is that for the greater good at the expense of people the minority who don't know that suffer? Just because like otherwise there would be a lot less coherence in the field if they all had language barriers and stuff like that. I don't know. And also just like globalization as like is globalization of thought just giving the power to whoever has the most influence and they get to exert it haphazardly over everyone else?
I don't know haphazard part, but it does. So yeah. But anybody else wants to respond to this before I do, or without me responding? part of scientific discourse about its own awareness, about itself, is the separation of this historical, political, economic circumstances from the content of science. So there is this desire of what we do is, regardless of specific circumstances, will always lead to the same truth. And globalization, of course, can be justified on the basis, or accepted or endorsed on the basis of that, because it's a universal discourse. And so scientists claim, like, if you are making an experiment, it's not going to really depend on who you are, where you are, what funding you are using, etc. It's going to lead to the same result. Now, in principle, not, I mean, most scientists hopefully are reasonable people who acknowledge that empirically that's not the case, but in terms of principle, knowledge itself, what they consider to be pure knowledge, pure scientific knowledge, should be reproducible under all circumstances. And that somehow, both by acknowledging the pure, quote unquote, pure nature of science, allows it to escape from certain criticism. Yes, we might have done that in the past, but that was wrong. Yes, it might have happened in that country for a while, but that was wrong. Or we might have thought like science would justify racism, but that was wrong. So there's always that kind of both endorsing the methodology of the past while denying the content. So like, yeah, we might have been racist in the past, but they were bad scientists. Good scientist is not racist. Good science is not racist. But the fact that you are already looking for a concept of race, and now you are looking for that concept, not maybe under the term race, but in different ways, maybe says something about the nature of scientific activity. But no, that's like, it was wrong. It's finished. We made a mistake. We moved on because we are this discourse that can improve itself or makes itself better. Now, is that true? Maybe, maybe not. I'm not sort of that qualified to say that science will always be able to correct itself. It has this inherent tendency to correct itself. I'm sure a lot of scientists believe that, and that's perfectly fine. But the fact that we also have a history, we also have something that happened that influenced people and created a kind of reality that it cannot be just simply denied like a scientific theory. So one of the problems that we are having today, for example, with, I mean, not one of the, maybe the problem, is sort of like the question of race. Now I'm teaching a course on this to understand the way in which the race as a scientific category emerged in the first place. Because if you listen today, the discourse is that, oh, we thought that race was real. We scientists, biologists, etc., we thought that it was real. Oops, it wasn't. Our mistake. So as if like, oh, okay, if you made a mistake, let's forget about all of those things that happened in the last, 200-300 years. Or 400 years, or maybe even more, if you think that it is starting with the Greeks who invented the term barbarians, by the way. So then there's a reality, there's a historical reality that has to be addressed somehow. And science tells us that, oh, we can't address that because that was a mistake. Now everybody says like, oh, race is not a real category. Well, real in what sense? Real in scientific sense? Or real in the sense that it had a huge impact on the configuration of the world in the last 400 years. Is that not real? So when people believe something that might be scientifically wrong, doesn't make it any less effective or any less real in that sense. So I also want to concentrate on this idea of interpretation. Human beings are self-interpreting beings. What they think about themselves, it might be completely wrong. It still has an impact on them. So we are a species who at least lived and continues to live with the reality of race and racial distinctions. So now scientists telling us that, oh, it wasn't real, doesn't really do anything. It's like, okay, good for you. Like you preserve the purity of your discourse. You are, I mean, that's also a kind of like pure white discourse to me. Like, oh, we are not racist. Everybody else might be racist, but science as a discourse, that's not racist because we discovered the falsehood of the concept of race. It's like, what are you talking about? That's sort of a denial of history that you participated up until yesterday. So to claim that now you are beyond reproach is really, as you know, for those of you who live in the United States, like that's what I observed in the United States, is that like it's more important that you are not racist than the entire country. I mean, you throw the entire country under the bus as long as you don't think that, or people don't think that you are not racist. That's really main American like sort of concern, like I'm not racist, fine. So the question in front of us is we are looking at a tradition, and that tradition has its own reality. And when I want to, when I read this, even in this book, when even the editor, the person who, how she identifies certain aspects as the Greek, that's proper Greek, as opposed to that's not proper Greek. Like, what does that even mean? Like you already have a question of identity there. Why Millet? Why that geographical area? Like what happened? Like after a border, people stop. Oh, we are not thinking anymore. Some people were thinking about certain issues, but others were not. So we are creating a myth of culture, that it has a unity, that it has integrity, and we belong to that culture. And I want you to be aware of that very tendency of how we create identities, both historically, culturally, politically, economically. So whenever we talk about globalization, we are talking about this in terms of the question of diversity, as if it is a dinner table that everybody comes and says what they think. That's really not how it works. That's not really how science works. Yes, there is a pure description of scientific activity, like we do experiments and experiments yield to results. That's how they teach you. That's the pedagogy, etc. But the reality is that science is inextricably linked with the economic structure. You cannot get any funding for anything. You cannot do any significant scientific contribution unless you are politically, economically integrated. That's the reality. Yeah, Olivia, please. Science, define, please.
Well, I'm not really interested in defining science, but I am, I guess, I agree that your ability to participate in science is sort of fundamentally linked with the economic structure when you do science in a country like the United States, and like you need to secure funding, you need to apply for grants or private funding, and that creates a lot of problems in the pursuit of science. But it's my understanding of science as a methodology that it can be applied outside of those sorts of economic structures. And like an example of that I think is really important is, like, for example, the medical research programs that are that take place in like a country like Cuba, where like the economic system is entirely different. So science happens in a very similar way, but the economic it's sort of been completely removed from one economic structure and put in the context of like this economic structure that's totally that our society is completely hostile to. But yet the sort of ability of science to generate pure knowledge, which I know is a problematic concept, but in that context, you know, science is still able to produce important and helpful results. And actually, like, Cuba has one of the best like medical research programs in the world. So like, the idea of science being inextricably linked to a certain economic system, I feel like it's because of the fact that it can be translated out of the capitalist system to some degree, makes me skeptical of that idea.
No, that's
And
a really
as well as, I'm sorry.
That's a good point. Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm mostly done with what I was saying.
Now, of course, there is that aspect of scientific discourse in the sense that there is a pure aspect of it independently of the economic structure. And I wasn't really thinking about necessarily capitalism versus socialism or whatever there is now in Cuba. I'm not really sure what it is, communism or whatever, or socialist dictatorship, depending on your perspective, blah, blah. The question is like, the knowledge cannot be generated independently of power. Now, I'm sure in Cuba also people or the state are supporting that scientific research at the expense of other things. They are not supporting other things. They are supporting medical, but they are not having a space program as far as I know, but who knows, whatever. So there's always that kind of support, economic or political, that is necessary for the scientific knowledge to continue to produce knowledge. That's what I was trying to say, not just capitalism may not be the best way to engage in scientific activity either, capitalism, because then you need to have practical consequences and generate money. Therefore, like, there is a lot of advances in medicine in the United States as opposed to medical care, because medicine produces money as opposed to medical taking care of people. That doesn't really create as much revenue. So the kinds of directions that you go might be affected by the nature of the economic system, but every scientific activity needs that support, especially with the kind of sophistication that we are talking about science today. So it's not just the methodology that they teach you in the classroom, but the entire infrastructure that is associated with it. So that was the point, but your point is well taken, that I didn't mean to suggest that it was just one economic system or one way of producing knowledge. But we do somehow preserve the purity of the scientific discourse. Now, so far, this is the history of scientific activity and the way in which academy in general engages with knowledge. And that's, it's not just true of science, that's true of English, that's true of management, the way in which they think about the economic theory, that is true about psychology, etc. But there is an extra philosophical question, and that's what I want to get to. So for scientific knowledge to be possible, and this is really the crucial aspect, for scientific knowledge to be possible in total, like the whole scientific activity, the way in which we understand it in the 21st century, there must be some philosophical presuppositions that are already accepted. We need to accept the structure of the world in a certain way. We need to look at objects in a certain way. We need to look at human beings in a certain way. And that is the philosophy of science. That's the sort of more fundamental ways of producing knowledge. Now, scientific knowledge is a metaphysical, is the result of metaphysical presuppositions. What is the world made of? What is the role of the human being? How do we understand human being? What is the nature of perception? What is the nature of human mind? We don't raise these questions, we don't ask these questions, but that doesn't mean that we already operate with answers to these questions. And the most fundamental answer is like nature. Like we look at nature ever since Descartes in modern philosophy in terms of the object of mathematical calculation. If anything that distinguishes modern science today from, I mean, there was also always science, but we somehow are fascinated with the modern science. So what distinguishes modern science from ancient Greek science that these people were actually engaged in is the use of mathematical knowledge. So whenever physicists today talk about the nature of the universe, they're not talking about observation, as far as I know, since they're not going to go back 13 billion years and look at it, but they are talking about calculations. They are talking about the way in which our theorizing about the nature of the world is through mathematical calculation. The world has to reveal itself as the object of mathematical knowledge in the first place. And that happens with Descartes. So again, that doesn't make science false. I'm not saying that science is like mistaken or something like that, but these basic fundamental presuppositions exist. And we need to acknowledge that. And once you question these basic presuppositions, where you might end up might be different than the acceptance of these presuppositions. And that's really the role of philosophy that is not ever going to be actually performed by science itself. Because whenever you go to, a class even, it's like, this is how we operate. This is our methodology. And philosophers might ask those unnecessary and meaningless questions that we won't have answer to. We don't ask those questions and we don't even raise them. Now, great, don't do whatever you like. You have the money and the power. What can I say? But just because you don't ask those questions doesn't mean you don't operate with answers to those questions. And I think that, to me, is really the definition of hegemony. Well, not exactly, but one of the aspects of hegemony. Like, you ask questions. I don't need to ask those questions. Do you have questions? No, we don't ask them. Let other people ask that question. Philosophers, they have these kinds of stupid, deep questions. We don't deal with them. That's not within our scope, which means we can continue doing what we want without being questioned about it. And we consider them non-legitimate questions. And that's a very interesting definition to me of power, in the sense of, like, you do not allow certain questions to penetrate into your discourse. And since you live in the United States, you should be aware of how this works politically, at least. Yes, Olivia.
Do you think that it's possible to have like an academic field worth having, where certain questions are considered outside of its scope, but
Sure.
not considered illegitimate? Like, I feel like, for example, like with the field of physics, like we do make a huge, like, long set of like presuppositions about the world, the correctness of which can be questioned and the correctness of which it's important to question. But the thing is, the sort of lines of inquiry that we take, like, don't deal with those questions, basically because in order to do physics, basically we need to pick some set of like axioms
Yeah.
and thoughts about the world. But that doesn't mean that we like don't think that questions about the correctness of those axioms are bad or useless. It's just like not.
Mhm.
I don't know.
Fruitful or relevant for what you are doing immediately.
Not even. I think they are relevant. But what I also think is that, like, there are these huge complex theories of the natural world in terms of mathematical principles that we build up, and those theories have, like,
Mhm.
been useful in many contexts. Sometimes the context in which they're useful are like damaging, for example, like with the development of like the atom bomb, but they are still seeming to uncover some, like, if not fundamental, then at least emergent truth about the world. But
Mhm.
like, so if physics were to spend its time focusing on these sorts of fundamental questions about the axioms that we pick at the beginning, then these sort of larger theories and frameworks wouldn't be built, because there'd be no way to sort of move on from those questions, because
Sure.
you can't solve those questions. You kind of have to, if you want to do something like build up a complex mathematical theory of the universe, you just need to pick some.
No, that's true, and I mean that obviously any science, not just physics, but other scientists too, have that legitimate domain of inquiry, and that precisely because they don't ask those fundamental questions all the time, that they can make progress in certain other areas that they consider to be the object of their knowledge. Sure, and I think philosophy maybe to a certain extent is responsible for that too. But the question in front of us, I think that what I want to get out of this class in philosophy in general, but the reason that we think read ancient Greek philosophy is, today in the 21st century, we believe in this fundamental distinction that if we continue to do business as usual, as informed by scientific activity, we are going to be fine. We are going to survive. We are going to live as human beings, although this might be questioned, obviously, but some people believe that. So, or if we do some crazy backward thinking, etc., we are going to return to the Middle Ages or some version of that nonsense. So I think that I'm questioning that kind of opposition. Namely, is it possible that our way of thinking about science really brought us to this moment of crisis? Is it possible that the world, which was exploited through scientific inventions for the last 400 or 500 years, came to this state of affairs because of a much more intrinsic connection between science, technology, and industry than we are willing to admit, because we want to preserve the purity of scientific discourse in terms of pure science, but we don't want to attribute engineering, the transformation of the world, change of the natural resources, change of the climate, etc., to scientific activity. We want to preserve that purity of knowledge without acknowledging its possible detrimental effects because of science, not despite of science. And I think that's the question that we need to ask ourselves, because usually whenever ultimately science justifies itself is that it works and it makes human life longer, I suppose, and it makes it more comfortable, I suppose. We would die of disease if it wasn't for science, sure, and all the other things. But if ultimately we are going to die in this worldview and destroy our planet, isn't this a kind of paradoxical justification to justify everything in terms of human convenience? And they say, if it wasn't for science, like somebody would tell me today, like, what are you talking about science? If it wasn't for science today, you would die of COVID. I was like, yeah, I'm dying anyway, which is really not the point. But if I'm dying because of some of the detrimental aspects of industry, that's also scientific method. That's also science that built that industry. So if ultimately we are going to bring about our end on the planet, what kind of a justification is that to live a little longer? So that's the, yeah, well, I mean, always the same people talk, so I feel like this is becoming a kind of pattern, but if anybody else wants to please jump in and set us straight and make us like talk about other things, I would be happy to. Okay, go ahead, Charlie.
I mean, conversely, like why not just like keep pushing forward with any kind of advancement possible, because we're going to die anyways, so might as well try to find something. I mean, try to just do everything within the human capacity right now.
That's
To
what we
do.
are doing.
I
That-
think that there are restraints on science, right? Like
Uh,
there are this ethics of science.
Oh, okay. So you can. Oh, yeah. Well, unless it works for Trump, then there isn't. But yeah, um, that was. I think that a lot of people, sort of, regardless of their ideological convictions, would, when push comes to shove, they will go with the possibility of scientific activity rather than restrictions on ethics. But yes, you're right. There are some restrictions. Yes, you all took bioethics, I suppose. Some of you at least. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yes, Olivia.
So I I'm not sure if I'm understanding you correctly, but so are you viewing science itself and the scientific discourse as the driver of things like industry, exploitation of natural resources, pollution, things like that?
Absolutely.
Okay. Um,
Historically speaking, yeah.
do you think so? I guess the way that I think about it is as um, you know, like that capitalism and imperial capitalism are the sort of um, socio-political drivers of things like that that use science as a tool to enact exploitation and enact harm. But do you think that that's a useless distinction to make?
No, it's a useful distinction, but that sort of doesn't acknowledge the direct influence of scientific discourse in the exploitation of the universe. Because even if you investigate the origin of the emergence of modern science, literally, Bacon describes the production of knowledge as torturing of nature. You need to squeeze answers out of nature. So we look at this scientific activity as a kind of innocent, distant, sort of disinterested knowledge, which it never was. And it can never be, at least philosophically, because of its fundamental presuppositions about what nature is. So yes, I do, at least, I'm not saying science is responsible for that, but we don't serve ourselves if we don't acknowledge how even scientific knowledge sometimes literally emerges from industrial intervention into the world. So it is not a pure discourse and its application, but it is a much more circular phenomenon. So the way in which scientific knowledge did now, pedagogically, when we introduces the idea of science, of course, we sort of present it in its purity. This is the method. You do this, you put your apron on, you go to the lab, you do this, you do that, and then you sort of are fascinated with this kind of discourse as, oh, this is how it works. But when you start working or engaging in scientific activity, you realize that's not how it works at all. It works in much more complicated and intricate ways. So the point that I'm trying to make is perhaps just very simply that maybe we should think of life, as Sophocles said, as tragic. Namely, we use science as much as possible, as Charlie was saying, to push it as much possible to escape our predicament. But in fact, maybe by escaping our predicament, we are actually bringing about our predicament. That's the tragic aspect of human existence. That's what I mean, the tragedy of course, like we can't avoid it, but maybe we can start seeing it that way. Maybe we will not find a scientific solution to global climate change because scientific discourse is at least partially responsible for climate change.
I mean, so the thing that I don't know, like when you say that, like I completely agree that we're not going to find a scientific solution to climate change because climate change is a social and economic problem. Like science can already give us the tools to solve it you know, if we want to, but we're not going to, because the exploitation must continue, imperialism must continue, and so on and so forth. But I guess I just like, I don't know. I understand that problematic and harmful systems generate scientific knowledge, and I understand that they prop up the sort of pursuit of science.
Mhm.
But I guess I feel like the at least in my view, like the systems and power structures that make science so harmful would still exist and would still be doing harm if not for this specific discourse that we call science existing.
Sure. I mean, I don't want to overstate the case. I mean, I think that the reason maybe I overstate the case is because the opposite is so predominant. I mean, your perspective is, to me at least, appears to be more predominant. That's why maybe I'm overstating the case. So maybe I should put it like, is it a scientific question, or is it an interesting question, or is it a question to pose that science, like every other human discourse, is tragic, in the sense that Sophocles was saying in that section that I read, in terms of human being find all these solutions to agriculture, to even climate, etc., but cannot find any solution to death itself. So is it possible that the way in which we ideologically think about science somewhat contributes to our demise as well? Because we look at science in the way that maybe in the Middle Ages people looked at into salvation. Namely, if you just follow God and the church and nothing else, and don't be interfered by other power discourses and imperialism, etc., that is the salvation. And maybe we do have that kind of trust in science, in the sense that this is pure knowledge. It's going to give us the pure knowledge, if we can exclude all the other external elements and impurities of the scientific discourse. And my question is, philosophically, is there something intrinsically questionable within the way in which science understands the world? That's the question. That's the philosophical question. Okay, so the reason we are discussing this, for those of you who look at me confused and annoyed and board, is we are somewhat juxtaposing these questions of modernity to what we are reading here. Now, if we say someone who says, that is Thales, who can apparently do astronomy, there's the first story that they tell, like he falls into a well as he was walking, because he's looking at the star. That's a sort of typical, I like that. That's a typical characterization of philosophers. Like, your head is so far up the clouds asking these like abstract questions that we cannot possibly answer. Therefore, you just fall into that hole. I like that. I mean, I guess I would do that. That's a, you know, that's what you should do. Don't look down too much. Fall once in a while. It's okay. But that's the image of the philosopher. Like this simple person, serving girl, was making fun of him. Like, and that has been also a story that is told about philosophy. Like, I'm sure you had that too. Philosophy asks impossible, unanswerable questions. They ask very general questions to which everybody has subjective and different opinions to, blah, blah, these kinds of. This is not at all what interests me about philosophy. I don't care about anybody's opinion or whatever with respect to certain questions. The question, philosophical question, is that you already give an answer to that question as you engaged in an activity. So if you are a biologist, you already answered the question of what life is. The philosophical question is to figure out what your answer is. How do you understand what life is? If you are engaged in physics, you already have an answer what the nature consists of. Philosophical, well, I mean, not empirical answer, but what your presuppositions is with respect to nature. Like you don't believe that there is a supernatural force in nature. I mean, that would be literally outside of the domain of physics. There is no supernatural power, except at the very end, there's this mysterious black hole, I guess, so far. But that's also really pure calculation, as far as I can tell, rather than anybody has seen a black hole and looked at it and blah, blah. I mean, we represent it. But anyway, so the philosophical question is that, what is the answer that you are hiding from us? What is the answer that you are actually hiding from yourself? What is the presupposition that you are operating without even recognizing the need to question it? That's pure ideology. That's pure power, in the sense that certain fundamental things cannot be questioned, should not be questioned. And if there are questions, that might cause instability into the construction of the. Now, therefore, philosophy always, to a certain extent, causes some instability. And that's why it has never been liked, because I just want to continue with business as usual. Like, why do you ask me these questions? And maybe that's the kind of things that you feel when you are encountered with philosophical questions too. Like, it's like, okay, I've been living my life, you know, just going about my business, and then this guy or other people sort of ask me stupid questions, and I need to deal with those questions. There's no point. It's not going to make me rich. It's not going to make me happy. Definitely not. So I just want to continue. But maybe by not raising those questions, I mean, not maybe personally you, but certain structures can actually causing harm to other people. You are actually not questioning the sort of, I don't know, like I can be very nasty and say, like, if you live in the United States, you don't question the predominant culture. You don't question how certain practices that you engage every day actually contributes to the oppression of other people. So there is also that political dimension of philosophical reflection, that you need to raise certain questions. Now, on the other hand, it's important that they remain as questions rather than, oh, this is my answer. I'm not like, oh, ideologically, I want you to hate science, or ideologically, I want you to hate religion. Ideologically, I want you to think like me, or think like Thales, or something like that. I mean, the only thing is that ideologically, you should think. That's it. There's really no other sort of aspect of philosophy that wants to convince you to something positive. It's like, you should believe this. Now, you should maybe, if you say something like, you should believe in the necessity of questioning. So philosophy doesn't really advocate for anything other than itself, like engage with the world philosophically. I think that's really the first, maybe interesting aspect of Thales, because I read water as a question, not as an answer. How is that? Like, when you say water is the origin of everything, that's what he believed, that's what he said. We can read this. And of course, a bunch of things comes from Aristotle. So as you know, these are all fragments and testimonies, that not something that he himself wrote and put down. So whenever you read on page 13, 14, there's always Aristotle politics, Aristotle on the heavens, etc. They're all quotations from Aristotle, who talks about that. So is it possible that the world and the cosmos has one origin? Is it possible that it came from one basic stuff? Now, with when he says water, that to me, obviously, I mean, if you go there as it used to be, there is experience. There is experience of water. I don't know whether you have seen the Aegean Sea. If you see the Aegean Sea, you will believe that's the origin of everything, because it is both gorgeous and blue and wonderful and amazingly life-giving, etc. And so, yes, why not water? Of course, it's not true in the sense that there are other material in the world, but can we understand the world and the cosmos in terms of unity? Can it all belong to one origin? Can it belong to one fundamental principle? Now, right after water comes Anaximander and this idea of apeiron, which is already much more complicated, I think. But that's really the idea here in terms of philosophical thinking. I do not accept everything that, you know, the myths, the Hesiods, the Homers told me about the origin of the universe. I raise that question in you. I say it's water. It's like, how dare you? There is gods, there is Zeus, there is blah, blah. Like, to say that it is water is already like, what are you doing? You are somehow going against the tradition. You are already questioning the fundamental stories that are told about the origin of the universe and your society, your existence. You are saying water. It's like, what? I mean, there is Gaia, there is the earth, there is the cosmos, there is the titans, there is all these stories about, like, people tell about the origin of the universe, and you say water. How dare you? I mean, I don't want to dramatize, over-dramatize the case, but it is significant in that very sense that, you know, for example, something like, I don't know, I'm trying to find an analogy. If somebody would say, against all the myths of the United States, somebody will say, the origin of the United States is money. Yes, Olivia.
So, well, first of all, like, stop me from participating if I'm doing way too much. Like, oh, look at me, I'm a physicist today, because I know I've already spent a lot of time talking about science and being a sort of cheerleader for science.
Cool.
But one thing I did find interesting, though, when reading, it's Thales? That's
Thales, Thales. Thales
I'll
is
say
the English
Thales.
version. Thales, if you want to be Greek, yeah.
So I found this sort of declaration that, like, everything's water really interesting, because it actually feels a lot like the modern or the contemporary state of the scientific understanding of, like, fundamental things. Because we have this thing called the Standard Model that's supposed to describe all the fundamental particles and forces of the universe, and we know for a fact that it's wrong. Like, it does not have everything in it. Not all the information contained in it is correct, and there's possibly, like, a ton of stuff that it's missing. But we just, like, choose it as a starting point. We're just like, okay, this is the theory. This is the theory of everything, and then kind of, like, poke at it to, like, correct it a little bit, and or a lot. And that kind of reminds me of this same declaration that everything's water. Like, it seems like what Thales is doing is saying, like, okay, so, like, my best assumption I can make here is that, like, everything's water, and then you kind of see, like, how do you pronounce the name of his, like, the next person that comes in the lineage?
Anaximander?
Anaximander. Like, then sort of, like, perturbates that theory and, like, makes a correction to that. So it's like, no, it's not water, it's this sort of, like, infinite
Yeah.
ether. I'm sorry, I forgot the word. But I
Apeiron.
don't know. Yeah.
Apeiron.
Like, I find it interesting, this through line between, like, the concept of just picking a overarching theory that's supposed to explain everything and clearly doesn't, and then moving from there. I don't know.
No, that I mean, again, yes, that would be a good strategy for us to approach it. Of course, we really don't know what Thales said. I mean, this is really not a sort of historical account, because Thales didn't write. This is Aristotle reporting. Aristotle already writing most of it in physics or metaphysics, and even though he talks more in terms of Anaximander, in terms of physics. So he already decided that this is physics. Physics in ancient Greece is physis. The term comes from the ancient Greek physis, which really means nature, but it's also like sort of coming forth. being forth, becoming forth. So nature has always been something living. And maybe water as the origin of life, not just origin of stuff, but origin of living beings, because within physics that we have this sort of clear distinction between animate and inanimate objects. But ultimately, is the universe itself something animate or inanimate? And I don't know whether this can be answered with respect to sort of theories that exist. Like if you are a biologist, maybe you, but there's this fundamental opposition that is accepted between animate and inanimate object. So even though probably most of inanimate objects that are artificially created can be traced back to nature that is alive. So I'm looking at my table, which is wood, which was kind of a living tree at some point or something. Anyway, so I mean, you can think of these questions. Anyway, so I'm a little just talk too much because it's Zoom and you guys are quiet except for a couple. So I'm going to take a break, and then I ask you within that break, maybe like 9 minutes, we'll meet about 10:15, to indicate passages, questions that you want to ask, that you want to bring up, so that we switch more into interaction rather than me trying to present this material. So, but I think the basic presuppositions are clear with respect to Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, water, apeiron, air, and how Anaximander explains arche, the origin, which everything can be traced to. So you are going to bring up sections from the text to discuss in the second half, okay? Okay, we meet at 10:15. Okay, as I said, we are gonna frame this in terms of your questions and what you want to discuss. Nancy, do you have something? Because you owe me something from last time.
Yeah, I do.
Good.
Well, the bit I found really interesting was when he says, it's page 15, when he's talking about how maybe everything is in motion, and like that. I mean, I just looked it up quickly and it
The last one,
with physics, but
number 8.
yeah. Well, yeah, in number 8 he says about how the soul is productive of emotion, and then earlier I think he's talking about how kind of everything is becoming and becoming something else.
Can you read that?
In number 5.
Oh, number 5. Okay.
And number 8, both of them. He says in the second sentence is, for that of which all existing things are composed, and that from which they originally came to be, and that into which they finally perish, the substance persisting but changing in its attributes. This they state is the element and principle of the things that they are. For there must be one or more natures from which the rest come to be whilst it is preserved. Yeah, it was kind of just from that and the last point, just everything being in motion, and that's how everything existed. I thought was interesting, but confusing.
Why is it confusing?
Because I've never thought of the world like that before, I guess.
Okay. Like you don't think of world as changing, or what do you mean?
Well, yeah, I guess what I got from it is that that's like the fundamental thing, is that everything is changing and nothing is stable. And when I looked it up briefly, it was talking about how this idea means that everything being in motion is outside of space and time. And it means that that's the important thing, rather than space and time being these fixed boundaries in which everything is and in which we live. That instead the fixed thing is just that everything isn't fixed.
Okay, so motion is not something that, like, I'm moving this object from here to here. We are not talking about that kind of motion, but we are talking about a more fundamental motion of change. And Aristotle makes this, yeah.
You just froze for me. I don't know if that was just me.
No, yeah, that there seems to be some issue.
Yeah, because I'm home. I'm not in my office now, so I think that my internet is not as efficient as it is at Earlham. So, but I think what I said is motion is not just that motion that we observe, like moving an object from side to side or something like that, but a more fundamental motion of change. Like everything is in motion, the world is changing, that kind of motion. Yeah, that's, and why is that relevant? Like, why is it historically relevant that, because as this editor also identifies, there are really not that kind of clear distinction between science, philosophy, engineering, etc. Thales wouldn't even call himself philosopher. He wouldn't know the word. He wouldn't use the term, so he wouldn't identify what he is doing as philosophy as opposed to something else. So there is a sense in which human desire to understand the world is not separated into different categories. And I think that's really relevant, that it is also mixed with what we would perhaps today consider theological or religious or speculative or metaphysical. They are not invested in the purity of the discourse, the way in which we are today. So we are trying to understand the world, period. And we can use whatever means that are available to us, even though today we would say, oh, that's not scientific, or that's not rational, or that's not philosophical. So yeah, but that's an interesting passage. So the last one is like, from what is related about him, that's 8 on the same page. It seems that Thales too held that the soul is something productive of motion. What do you mean? What do you understand from that, Nancy?
I guess the same thing I was saying before about the thing about the soul is that it produces change. I don't really know.
No, that's true. But does it also affect the nature of that change? Like, if a change is according to soul, like soul produces motion, what would that imply as opposed to soulless change?
Could you rephrase the question?
Well, he says here that the soul is something productive of motion. And psyche is the word, the soul. If the soul produces motion, what characteristics does that motion have, as opposed to just purely mechanical, soulless motion?
Yeah, it seems like because so many other things, well, I guess everything he's saying also produces motion, that if that's the only thing about the soul that's special, then it's not very special, because everything produces motion. That's why he says that a lodestone or something must also have a soul. So it doesn't seem like a very satisfactory definition of a soul as like something extra to the rest of the world, to the material world.
Okay, so, but are you thinking about human soul here, or just soul in general?
Does things other than humans have souls?
Well, apparently the lodestone has a soul.
That's why I think it's not a good definition of a soul.
So you think only humans should have soul?
Well, I don't think a lodestone has a soul.
What's that?
I wouldn't say that a stone has a soul.
Why
Well,
not?
not human soul, but not, of course, because it's not human, but the soul is maybe a principle according to which it changes. So having a soul really means that there is a reason, there's an explanation. That's a motivation for the change. That really means soul. Like, you know, whenever we do certain things, we imagine that we have a reason for doing them. We have a soul, we have a principle of our motion. Like, why are you here? I mean, you probably don't ask this to yourself because you know, opened up the web page and then saw that there are a bunch of classes that you added some, etc. But there's a reason why you're here, right? You at some point decided, like, I'm going to take this class. Like, your motion has a reason. It's not just mechanical motion of the pen falling. So, and to believe that this is nature, nature has a reason to be what it is, to become what it is, as you said, change, to be in motion. And
So
it has
yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, so maybe if we're going to assume that there's something special about us as humans compared to a stone, then the difference is that we choose that reason.
Well, but it seems like the lodestone also, he said that the lodestone has a soul because it moves iron. So maybe we are not that special.
But we could move in different directions.
Okay, so
As a matter.
okay, so we leave it as it is as to whether human beings have a special location in nature. This is the debate. This is the question. And it seems like Thales thinks that the world itself has its own possibility of moving to a multiple possibilities. So, I mean, that's really the question that we can ask with respect to the first half of the class that we are asking with respect to science. Like, is there only one actual world and that's it? I mean, even physics today are just talking about probability and multiplicity of possibilities of how the world could have been, how nature could have been, but maybe even in some alternative universes is, but is there only one motion? Is there only one possibility of motion? Is it determined how the world and the universe is going to be? So I don't know much about quantum mechanics, but if you analyze the subatomic particles, I don't think they behave in a way that we comprehend immediately.
Oh my god, they behave so fucked up. It's incredible.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure fucked up is a scientific expression, but that seems to be unlike what we expect. Yes, that's correct. Yeah. Okay, good point. So he at least believes that there is a certain either predictability or reason for things to become what they are. And I think that's a very important philosophical recognition, that things are the way they are because there's a reason for that. That speaks both to origin, as RK later as Anaximander does, but also to causes. Okay, bless it.
I just wanted to ask, like, as a clarification, so the idea of like everything having a soul, is it because everything is always changing? That's where the reasoning comes from, that like everything is changing because it has a soul, or like everything changes and then has a soul. Like, I don't know how to ask this question, but like I'm a bit confused when it comes to.
Well, I mean, of course, for us, this is very difficult to ask this question, but from our perspective, if something changes, we can distinguish me looking out the window because I decided to do it, as opposed to this pen falling down because it doesn't have any other choice. So when we say everything has a soul, it's not just they are all in motion. Yes, they are in motion, but they are in motion because of something, because of a motivation. There is a reason for it. And there is a reason that is related to soul. That's a principle according to which they are moving. It's not just empty, blind movement. So that seems to how I read this. The soul is something productive of motion. The soul produces that motion. Yes, Isaac. I like the way you raise your hands with your physical hands, even though there's this beautiful feature of Zoom that you can raise your hand. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
See, it puts you on the left-hand corner to the top when you raise your hand. So good. Okay, go
Okay,
ahead.
cool. I just found it interesting that it almost seems to me like, looking at it from a modern scientific perspective, that we would almost describe that, like if you look at all the subatomic particles, it seems like you could predict what a human would do. It almost seems to me like we are kind of just that random assortment of chemicals that have come together. And so that, like, so it almost feels to me like there is no soul in the concept that he's thinking of humans having. But in that respect, he's right that we have the same soul as the lodestone, and that it's just really just random.
Well, I want to be careful here. I'm not, of course, a scientist to the extent that, I can teach physics or something. But I think that there's a distinction between the predictability of human behavior in terms of biological, chemical, physiological mechanisms, and us becoming like a totally predictable machine, as opposed to subatomic particles, in which actually we are really, even in physics, we are talking about an unpredictability. So there is a tension there, even within the so-called scientific understanding of the world, that subatomic particles do not behave in the way that you can control them and somehow predict. And it's the very notion of unpredictability or undecidability is really inscribed into its physical behavior. So in that sense, I'm not really sure that we as human beings, yes, we might be just totally predictable, not because we are subatomic particles, but we are not. So that might be one distinction that we might want to be careful about. But otherwise, you're right, in the sense that maybe if we think that we are not unpredictable, but we are actually very predictable, and we have no interesting to contribute in terms of, we are not even as good as subatomic particles, actually.
Yeah, I just meant less from like a human perspective, but if there was like, I don't know, some sort of being out there that could understand everything that's going to happen and understand every subatomic particle and how everything really works.
Yeah.
Like, I think they could probably, given the random assortment of molecules that make us up, predict exactly what we're going to do.
Okay, I have something to say to that, but Charlie, go ahead.
What's the difference between saying that and whoever knows the soul of everything can know everything? I feel like it's just on different levels of unknowing, because like, yeah, I kind of just saw, I thought that this piece was interesting because with the pre-Socratic philosophy, and the pre-Socratics, they go from like, this is how it is, and I know this, and the muses say that this is true. And so the reliance on a divine being to verify what is unknowable to one person. And then from that comes a whole new way of thinking and using nature, but then immediately giving this incredible power to some supernatural entity that is the soul. And even now, there's unknown attributions that we just kind of place within the properties of things, I guess. I think it's just changed, but the principle kind of with like quantum mechanics, it's like the uncertainty principle. That means we can know one thing but completely, but then that means we knew nothing about the other. And I don't know. I just, yeah.
Yeah. I think that Okay, this is just going a little bit off tangent, but I just say it and then maybe we should leave it at that because we are not maybe as knowledgeable about the contemporary science as we imagine. But Callie, do you have something to contribute? Sorry, I saw your hand.
Yeah, so I guess this is like, I feel like I'm having a hard time like engaging with this discourse because like maybe I missed it in the reading, it is reading, but like they're talking about like, oh, the soul is mixing with the whole universe and like everything has a soul, but I guess I'm like confused as to like what a soul is and like can we even like define what that is? And so it's just like I'm having a hard time like being on the same page is like what they're saying because I don't really know exactly like what a soul is. If that makes
Well,
sense.
none of us do. I don't think that anyone does. I think that in this context, because all we have is this little passage from Aristotle on the soul, the anima, the work that he wrote, and then from what is related about him, it seems that Thales too held that the soul is something productive of motion. The Greek term is psyche. We know what that is, but what does it mean to have the soul as productive of motion? At this point, the only thing that we can very minimally project is that there is a reason for motion. It has a soul, a purpose, a reason. Now, up until the story goes, up until to the pre-Socratic philosophers, they tell us the nature of the universe through myths. You know, somebody was carrying the earth on its back and then that created it out of chaos and blah, blah, all these like Greek myths about the origin of the universe. Now, and then you say, why? Why did that happen? It's like, it just happened. That's the nature of myth. And it's like, why was it like that? It's like, that's the way it was. So giving an explanation in terms of motion that has a soul is like, there's a reason for the way in which happened. And I think that there's a very important step is taken here, namely, we can actually understand as human beings the structure and the origin of the universe, as opposed to somebody telling us stories that are theological in character, which exceeds our comprehensibility. And I think that's a really important distinction. Today, both with religion and science, we still trust that there is a unitary origin of the universe that we can understand. We think that, whether explicitly or not. Now, we know we are far short of that, but in principle, we can get there. As opposed to thinking, you know what? The origin of the universe itself is ambiguous and there's nothing to know. It is undecidable. It is impossible to even comprehend. That's a completely different approach to life because fundamentally we think that we can figure this out. And that is both what philosophy brings and maybe tragedy a little bit resists because we don't believe that the universe itself is tragic. We think that the universe is decidable, that there is a cause, there's a way it had happened. But again, like the question is not whether there is actually or there is not, and you can ponder that late at night in the dark by yourself, etc. But for our purposes, as to whether we as human beings operate with the assumption that we can figure it out, as opposed to it is undecidable and it can never be figured out. That's a very important distinction. Today's science, it appears to me, that believes that you can actually unlock the secrets of the universe. I mean, some scientists do. Well, some scientists may say, oh, we have a long way to go, but in principle. Yes, Jack.
Yeah, I might just be a bit ignorant here, but like before I took this class, when I thought of philosophy, it was things that were very abstract, very thought compelling, and less scientific. For instance, the whole Socrates to do is to be Is that what he said? I think so. But regarding like the role of science in philosophy, like reading the reading that we had for today, all three of them talked about how they perceive the universe, how they scientifically kind of explained, you know, the meaning of not the meaning of life, but you know, why we're here, how we're here. While throughout whenever I thought philosophy, it was things that were kind of like, what's the meaning of life? Why are we here? You know, stuff like less scientific stuff. And maybe it's because of how the philosophers in ancient Greece were also physicists and other scientists. So maybe that's why they tackled a lot of these thoughts and questions through science. But for me, I've never really thought of philosophy as scientific. So yeah, just I don't know what it's like nowadays, obviously, because that's why I'm taking a 100 level class. But does science still play a major role in philosophy?
Unfortunately, not vice versa. I think philosophy doesn't play as much role in science. But you're right. I mean, the part of the paradox of posing philosophical questions like the meaning of life, that like philosophy asked about the meaning of life, and that changes according to the individual, therefore it is abstract and undecidable, etc. Unfortunately, it is not. Unfortunately, we as a generation historically define the meaning of life in fairly similar terms to each other. You know, in the 21st century, what can you say? Like love, family, success, blah, blah, like whatever things that we are associating with, like having meaningful connection with other people. Yeah, because we are very individualistic in 21st century, because that's why we think of the meaning of life. Maybe like in the Middle Ages, someone thinking of the meaning of life as getting rid of all the people around me because they are oppressing me, etc. So it is always a historical, specific, contextual question, even something as appears to be as abstract as meaning of life. So therefore, yes, philosophy is the sort of combination of how do we like think about the world in terms of science, how do we think about each other in terms of politics, etc. So rather than this meaning of life being an abstract question, is actually a very specific question. And in fact, it is much more common, unfortunately, for us to think what the meaning of life is, you know, with other people around us. Like if I were to take a survey now, like, what do you think the meaning of life is? Like, you'll probably give answers that are similar to each other.
Well, then it kind of looks like the lot of questions we have in philosophy isn't really just philosophical. You know, it's like are things like history and like science a variation of philosophy, or is philosophy you know, like a variation of history and science, or and the different sciences? So like, you know, like what's the point of philosophy then if we have history and sciences to explain everything else in the world?
Sure. And what's the point of history if we have philosophy? What's the point of science when we have philosophy? Like that was the beginning. Therefore, I mean, history didn't exist. Well, Hesiod was like, they were talking about stories, etc. But a systematic study of the past is initially a philosophical question. Science is initially a philosophical question. So when you are asking that question can be reversed and asked like, we really don't need any other discipline than philosophy. Like all these like sort of different majors that you have are meaningless because there's only philosophy. Those are the variations of philosophy. I don't know what you are studying. And to prove my point further, if you actually stop being bachelor and master and become doctor, if you get a PhD, you are all going to become philosophers. So the more you study, the more you become philosopher. So you might as well start now, because all the other disciplines that you are studying are meaningless. Because, you know, history without philosophy is just Wikipedia. You know, psychology without philosophy is just, I don't even know what that is. Nothing.
MK Ultra.
What's that?
MK Ultra.
And Play Ultra? What is that?
Oh, it was a CIA program in the 60s that attempted to control people's
Okay.
minds via the
I
use of
didn't-
hallucinogens.
I didn't know that, but yeah, I don't know what it is. I mean, you can argue the same point. So when we are reading ancient Greek philosophers, we are reading everything. We are reading not just exclusively philosophy, but we are reading history, we are reading science, we are reading psychology, etc. So that's a good point, Jack, to keep that in mind, because it's not distinguishable. And that's precisely the point that she makes by introducing that. They say they wouldn't even call themselves philosophers. So philosophy as a discipline wouldn't even exist. Okay, Josue.
Yeah, this is a bit about metaphysics. So the way I understood the introduction was that basically what what separates the Greeks from everyone else is that they started like making distinctions on knowledge and the possibility of it, which I mean we're doing that with Kant in our class and everything. But I had this thought of basically when I was reading all the ideas and descriptions of the universe and the world, I thought to myself, we've been doing this for a long time and we've been discovering that what we think about things is wrong, and then someone comes up and like Galileo, for example, comes up, and then like Newton, whatever. And so it came up to me to what if everything that we know now is wrong? Like what if everything that we've come to know in like 1,000 years will be like just the definition of an era and a time and thinking, just like we're now doing with the Greeks.
Absolutely.
And how are we so certain about everything now? If when we look at the Greeks, we can say that it's just like, you know, they were so sure about it and now it's ridiculous. It's just, yeah, I feel like I was high, you know, I wasn't obviously, but just reading all of that, man, just made me think of, anyways, yeah, that.
I'm glad it made you high. Okay, Olivia.
I mean, I really like that point, and I feel like it gets to, like, I don't know if it fits in the same framework of tragedy that we laid out at the beginning, but it definitely feels like a tragic thing about life to know with almost certainty that everything we know and think and understand about the world and about our lives now will not be preserved, and our understanding will be totally different in 1,000 years, you know, if there are humans in 1,000 years. Like it's sort of like the inevitability of the destruction of our sort of truth, I feel, is kind of tragic.
Sure. I mean, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. I think that, yes, maybe not even 1,000 years, that's a little generous, but even like in a couple of 100 years, we are going to say, oh, in 2020, people used to think this about COVID. They were stupid or something like that. They were so unprepared and blah, blah. So that is going to happen. That is the passage of time. And we are going to read that fragment from Anaximander about how things pay penalty to each other with respect to time. Yes, and I think, you know, that's inevitable. I mean, even within the scientific discourse, that's going to happen. But there is a kind of also belief of a developmentalist understanding of human existence. So science nowadays maybe is more mindful of the fact that, yes, these people made these mistakes. Therefore, those mistakes actually build us as the correct one now. We rely on those mistakes. Those mistakes brought us here. And that's kind of a more Hegelian developmentalist understanding of human knowledge. So yes, they might be wrong, but in their wrongness, they contributed to human understanding. So there's that kind of evolutionary approach too, which doesn't make it any less tragic, but at least it explains a little bit. Yes, we know Newton was now, from our perspective, was wrong, but it still works. I mean, you can still calculate according to Newtonian laws and then get by and make use of that knowledge, even though technically speaking, now we don't consider that to be the correct physical understanding of the world. The same with Euclidean geometry, the same with absolute time and space, like according to Einstein, it's not. So according to quantum mechanics, we can't even talk about like meaningfully anymore in terms of spatio-temporal existence, like particles, as Olivia very eloquently described, behave in fucked up ways. So they don't even follow the sort of spatio-temporal sensibilities. But that knowledge contributed to our understanding now. And yes, we are also going to be the victims of people 200 years from now who are going to think us and say, they were dead wrong about COVID, but it really helped us to figure out how we avoided COVID-33 or whatever they will call it now, just like we are thinking about Spanish flu and blah, blah. So yes, that's a part of tragedy. But underlying all this, there is this belief in the principle that humanity one day is going to figure out the secret and the origin of the universe. That's the notion of arche. That's the notion of, comes to be explained in terms of the origin. And Anaximander defines that origin as apeiron, boundless, which is, yes, a principle, but a principle of boundlessness in the sense that maybe there is not one origin of the universe. Maybe we can never, in principle, explain and understand the origin of the universe. That's really what Greeks believe, that they pose them as a question. And it seems like they do believe that there is one origin that we can understand. That's the confidence of the emergence of the philosophical ideas, that we can figure out the origin of everything. Because we are talking about it. I mean, we are saying it. It's water, it's air. It's like, how do you even know that there is one thing? How do you even know that there is a thing that you can actually meaningfully talk about? Just listen to the stories of your gods and shut up. Just go with the myths. Just go with the, stories. So anyway, okay, good, okay. We have time. Somebody else wants to bring more specific from the text?
Can I say something about it really quick?
Really quick, sure.
Yeah, so what do you think? We obviously relied on our senses for like our observations, our like scientific knowledge sometimes. And that's obviously, like, as you said, so people who are wrong serve as like they help to like correct ourselves. But so what about things in themselves, right? Like what if we were wrong all along, in the sense that, I mean, we were not even in the, like, they were like, the people who were wrong, and we try to keep being on their path of knowledge, and it happened to be another path for things in themselves. Does that make sense? Like, what if we just,
What?
Rome? Go on.
If you're asking me what I think, that doesn't make sense because I don't know. I mean, I'm never gonna say what I think, but I think the way in which philosophical tradition interprets itself is that, yes, you might be completely wrong, but even that contributes to the next stage of the development of consciousness. That's the Hegelian view. Now, you might also say it's just wrong and you throw it away. That seems to me a little bit problematic because, I mean, it's a cliche that people say that you learn more from your mistakes and blah, blah. So I think that we might at least say, well, Aristotle was wrong. That's what scientists say all the time, which always shows me that they never really read Aristotle or understand Aristotle, but they say Aristotle is wrong. Whenever a scientist say that Aristotle was wrong and makes fun of Aristotle, you should please shut them up and say, you don't know what you are talking, or at least ask them like, how much did you read Aristotle? So, but even Aristotle being wrong maybe contributes to how science defines itself today. But also maybe we can think of it as a different way of understanding the world. And we might not consider that as a mistake, but an alternative understanding of the world. So to rehabilitate that kind of understanding. So I don't know. I mean, you should never trust what I think anyway. You should just read Aristotle or read these philosophers themselves rather than my opinion. But yeah, somebody had a hand. Who? Oh, blessed. Oh, Jared. Jared never spoke. Go ahead.
I never spoke.
You did. You just did.
Yeah, I did. Did you say my name or?
I said Jared.
Oh, Jared. I was like, Jared. Okay, sorry.
Not Jack, Jared.
I was gonna say on page 19, also number 19, it says, he also declared that in the beginning humans were born from animals of a different kind, since other animals quickly managed on their own and humans alone required lengthy nursing. For this reason, they would not have survived if they had been like this at the beginning. It makes me think that it's like a pre-thought to evolution. That like that's how I interpreted it. And it's like a co-evolution with our species. It wasn't like two people like Adam and Eve style. It was like all of us as a species evolved.
Yeah, Adam and Eve didn't even exist. Like, wow, not like in the Bible at the time of Anaximander. But yeah, no, that's a good point actually. So there's that sort of proto-evolution, evolution biology. Yeah, yeah, I mean that's a sort of really maybe this is also the tragedy or tragic aspect of human existing. We require lengthy nursing, like no other animal. We are terrible. That's why we are sort of becoming the master of the world in terms of all animals, because we are so pathetic, and our pathetic nature has to be overcompensated with enormous power over nature, because if you leave a child, they'll just die. Like no hope. Like you can't even survive on your own. Yeah, sad. Okay. Who wants to go? Isaac or Blessed was first, and then Isaac. Go ahead.
I just kind of had a question about on page 16, I think it was. Like that's the first time it's mentioned. What hot and cold like are referring to? Like I just don't fully understand what it means when it says like Anaximander does not say what this something productive of hot and cold is. The hot takes the form of fire, the origin of the sun and the heavenly bodies, while the cold is a dark mist that can be transformed into air and earth. I just don't really fully understand what like hot and cold are.
Yeah, I mean, you get cut off. So you are talking about page 16, the italicized text, and then
Yes.
Both air and earth are originally moist, but became drier because of the fire. Is that what you read?
Yeah.
Okay, so this
Yes, that's what I was reading.
Yeah. Okay, so that's not what Anaximander said. This is what, I mean, so Anaximander, unlike Anaximenes, is talking about a principle, not a physical stuff. So these opposites turning to each other, this is the principle according to which the universe is explained for him. So he's concentrating on the principle, how the hot turns into its opposite, how dark, moist can be transferred into air and earth. So for him, the principle is physical characteristics turns into their opposites. That's what motivates the universe, the world, not air or not water. You still have to explain how air air changes and the water changes, but the principle, which is apeiron, it's unbounded. You cannot attribute anything positive to that basic principle, according to Anaximander. So in many ways, I always thought that Anaximander appears so infinitely more sophisticated compared to Thales and Anaximenes. I don't know why, because the way in which they are represented, it just doesn't even make sense to me. Like somebody says water, and then somebody comes and says apeiron, and then the other one goes to air. It's like, what are you doing? We just like had this enormous leap in our understanding of the universe, and you go back to air. But I don't think that they are really thinking of these things in terms of oppositional terms. So whenever it says air, he doesn't simply talking about physical air that we understand it. And when Thales talks about water, I don't think that it is just the same H2O that we are drinking. It's not the same concept, which is very difficult to wrap your mind around, because, or what Olivia is drinking now, that's not just how he understands water as a principle.
That's actually pure white vinegar.
Really? Is that what you are drinking?
No, but I did actually accidentally like drink a gulp of pure white vinegar the other day because I was like trying to clean Sharpie off of something and I had it in a glass in my room, and then later I was like, oh look, a refreshing glass of water.
That also comes from what Thales names water too. So it's, you're okay, technically. Okay, Isaac.
Yeah, what struck me a lot reading this was like how, as Jared just brought up, like about the proto-evolution point, like how accurate, I guess, or still relevant a lot of these things were, like especially I found Anaximenes' conception of hot and cold to be like surprisingly accurate. Like, so on page 19, the point 21, where it says the air differs in rarity and density according to the substances. It becomes becoming finer, it comes to be fire. Being condensed comes to be wind and cloud, and further condensed, it becomes water, earth, stones.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like how we understand matter today, that the rate that the particles are moving affects the state of matter, and that's related to temperature as well. And so, yeah, I think it kind of speaks to Josue's point from earlier about how we know in 100 years, everything we know might just be wrong. But I think this kind of shows that that probably won't be the case. Like we are sort of on the right path, I guess, starting with this distinction between Thales and the earlier thinkers, and that he was actually basing it off evidence and actually giving an explanation. So yeah.
No, that's a great observation, because that speaks to our kind of narcissism with respect to the contemporary world. It's like how wonderful and great we are. And if we think of it from 100 years from now, we will have a different perspective. But if we also really think like, oh, these people, they were just like, oh, they believed in myths, they believed in Hesiod and Homer, etc. Yeah, like 2,500 years from now, some people might say, oh, they believed God came onto earth and became human. And like, we also live with their myths. So when we characterize previous historical periods as primitive with respect to us, we don't really understand our perspective very well, because we think that we are sort of rational, technological, because we can call each other with, well, we don't text each other with phone and blah, blah, that we are so much better than the Greeks, etc. So yeah, it gives us a perspective about, basically most of the things that he says today. I mean, they do observe the world. I mean, they are not stupid. They still look at things and they still see the moist coming when you especially in the today when it is hot and then it gets cold and the water condenses and it becomes rain, etc. I mean, science always, not just modern science, always relies on observation. But what really distinguishes modern science, and I keep saying this, is our ability to calculate, and our ability to make calculations and make large-scale equations, etc., as opposed to mere observation. I think that really differentiates modern science. But you should ask these questions to your teachers, to science teachers, and to other people. But please promise me, whenever anybody makes a claim about Aristotle, you will at least ask them, what did you read from Aristotle? These are the kinds of people in history that people like to take pot shots at. Like Aristotle is one of them for scientists, and psychologists, it's Freud. So it's like, Freud is this. Like, just please ask to any psychologist, it's like, how much Freud did you read, really? How many books did you read? Because he wrote quite a few. So what is your judgment based on? So that would be, please ask that question too. Like, because people who talk about Freud as an expert, including his sexism and racism, blah, blah, without really having read a word of what he wrote. And Aristotle too. And also it's very hard to read Aristotle. So. Okay, maybe we'll find some time to look at his writings as well, but like most of what we learn from here, at least, pre-Socratic philosophers also is the testimony of Aristotle. And mostly he characterized them in order to reject them too. So that's or to tell that they were insufficient. So we'll continue with this. I like this discussion. Those of you who didn't have a chance to talk, I apologize. We'll continue on Friday, again with discussion, no new reading. So basically up to page 22. So we'll discuss your whatever passage that you brought up, like Isaac or Jared, whatever passage you find interesting, but then we'll talk about the question of arche and apeiron in Anaximander, just to make sure that we cover those, okay? So we'll meet on Zoom again on Friday. I'll put this class online. I don't know whether you want to watch it, etc. Who is doing the protocol? Kate and Cameron. Okay, cool. So you are both here, so that's fine. But I'll put it there anyway, and there will be a link in Moodle for the video.